kind of interesting. It's just something I was thinking about today, where the Bible talks about not despising the day of small beginnings, and kind of that idea that how you start is very important. And so I was just kind of thinking about almost all of the biblical stories. If you go back in and look, particularly where I was seeing this was in Joshua, because that's kind of what I was studying at the time, that the format is that the Bible would go over the initial battle in a lot of detail, and then he went on to defeat this city and this city and this city and this city and that city. And so it's kind of interesting to look at it that when they get in, it gives all kinds of reference to Jericho, right? And a little bit to Ai and some of that. And then it says, then they went on and defeated this city and this city and this city. And it goes through that battle at Gibeon. So Jericho was kind of the first one, and then it kind of stops. Then it goes on and talks about how they came down here after that battle with Gibeon. That kind of set the stage for the campaign. So this is Israel, and this is the Dead Sea down here, and then Jericho, and up here in Galilee. That the basic way they crossed across the Jordan here, and then say if this is Jericho, they came up here, took Jericho. Gilgal is in this area. They camped there, went up to Shechem for a little bit, came back. Then Gibeon, who they had formed an alliance with, then is attacked by a conglomerate of kings from down here, right? And they realize that they're attacking, which is another part of the Amarna letters, that the Hapiru that we think were the Israelites, they said that they were concentrating on the hill regions, the mountainous areas, which is the other thing that we know that the Israelites were doing. But this conglomerate of kings comes up, and I guess their plan was to destroy Gibeon, right? So when we think about that, why they would want to destroy Gibeon, I think connects back with the Amarna letters. When you read those, they are fearful that all the other cities may do something similar, right? And then all of a sudden these newcomers will have alliances with a whole bunch of other cities, and they're thinking probably their best chance of victory is if all the people that are already there stick together. And so I would imagine, knowing that is their mindset going in from the Amarna letters, that when Gibeon does form an alliance with Israel, they're thinking we have to make an example of Gibeon. That Gibeon is the one that made an alliance. So if we make an example of Gibeon, that may keep all these other cities from wanting to do it. If they realize that they were immediately destroyed when they formed an alliance with Israel, then that should keep that in check, because their biggest fear was that many of these city-states would align with the newcomers, and then their city would be immediately destroyed. So I think it was kind of a preemptive message to everyone else. So anyways, though, Israel then comes down, and it talks all about this big battle where they defeated this group. And then it lists all these other places that they went to. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon in the Bible where the beginning gets many chapters, and then the rest just kind of gets a little bit of mention. Think back to Genesis. Adam and Eve get several chapters right in the beginning, and then it just gives a genealogy of the next 1,000 years. You have the conquest of the judges. So you'd get in a judge's life, they get called. You'd have the first week of their life. You get several chapters on, and then it says, well, and then they went on to do all of this. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about how the Bible does this. It focuses on the beginning, and you typically see God's mighty hand establishing things very strongly in the beginning, and that sets the precedent for their faith in the rest of their life. When they come up here, Hazor then is the first major battle. And so Hazor gets all kinds of attention. It's the first battle then of the northern campaign. And then it says, and then after that they attack this, and that. And so It's kind of an interesting way that it does throughout the Bible. There's many places where you see God kind of elongating the story at the beginning when he's launching somebody into their life. And then after that, it just kind of fades. So it just caused me to think that often God is focused on the start, and that they saw most of their miraculous things often at the start, and then that set the precedent for them to have faith. They saw miracles at the first couple battles. This first battle here, God threw stones on them, on the enemy. And then all the rest of the battles, presumably, were just regular hand-to-hand combat. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing. And then Hazor, God blessed them and defeated the enemy. And then all the rest of the battles, presumably, were just normal. So it almost kind of seems that God was intervening at the beginning so that they would know that he was there. Think of the wilderness. That most of what we have written in the Bible in last years, that the first year or so is when they failed to enter the promised land. And so, and all up before that was the Exodus in Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the water from the rock, the manna, all of that took place within that first year. Moses going up on Mount Sinai, coming down with the Ten Commandments, the golden calf, all of that stuff was like in the first year, and then they wouldn't go into the promised land, and so God tells them then, well, then for the next 40 years you're going to wander, and you don't get a whole lot of detail about what happened too much after that. You get a couple of Moses' stories and things like that, but most of the narrative is wrapped up in the beginning, and then they wandered for 40 years, and God showed them. Because a lot of these other things, long stretches of the Pentateuch, is what Moses received from the mountain. All of Leviticus and all of Numbers, and a lot of these things were things that God had shown Moses about the temple and the priesthood in that first year. And then so he's just explaining it in these other books. So most of the narrative is caught up right in the beginning, and then not so much for the rest of it. So it's just kind of interesting, the focus that the Lord puts on the beginning of things. And so I think there's probably some messages in that in the beginning, people would see the Lord's hand very strong, so that they would know that he was with them, and that God didn't necessarily intervene in miracles every time from then on out, but God caused them to win in what they were doing. But a lot of times in the beginning, God did it in front of them so that they would know that he was with them, and then from then on out, God did it kind of through them, so that, at the beginning, God threw stones. Then they said, wow, I can't see God, but he's clearly with us. He just threw stones on the enemy. And then all of their other victories, maybe God didn't throw stones on the enemy, but they were faithful to go fight because they knew now that God was with them, because he was very open in the beginning. Right? So it's just kind of interesting that you see not only God being miraculous in the beginning, but then you also see the way that the stories are told all throughout the Bible. There tends to be more of a focus on the beginning in the end. So you look at Jesus' life. The first year, all kinds of stuff. The last 2.5 or so years, all kinds of stuff. In fact, most of the Gospels take place in less than 1 year. There's stories spread out through his 2 or 3 years of ministry, but most of the Gospels, in fact, half of the Gospels are just that last week. The crucifixion and all that. A lot of times that's at least 40% of the Gospels is just that one last week. And then a lot of the rest of it is that last journey from where Peter confesses the Lord in Caesarea Philippi, then they come all the way down to Jerusalem for the crucifixion. So most of even the Gospels is that last year, but all of it really, so Jesus' whole middle part is gone. We see the birth narratives, and then we see the last couple years of his ministry, and most everything in between is kind of mystery. And then you see that same thing repeated in a lot of these other stories. Moses on Mount Sinai, then 40 years of wandering, and then Moses comes back in again and pronounces the blessings and the cursings again and goes through that whole long part in Deuteronomy where he's rehearsing. That's what Deuteronomy is the second telling of the law is what that word means. And so he kind of repeats it again. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting that the Lord puts a big emphasis kind of on the beginning and the end, not just in his power that he's doing, but in the way he tells the stories. He only shines the light on those parts too. So I think there's some application to that in our own life, that we often see the Lord get us started on things in a powerful way. And then it's up to us to then see that he showed himself to us in the beginning so that we would have faith for the journey. So that's what he tells the Israelites all the way through, is I allowed you to cross the Red Sea and see my hand so that from here on out you wouldn't doubt me anymore. And so I think we see this, that every once in a while the Lord shows us glimpses of his interaction in our life so that we can live our life in faith, knowing that even when we don't see him, that he's orchestrating everything. You know.
It's like the beginning of Christianity, and then a long period of time without a lot of going on.
From Jesus to the 1,000 years of peace, you don't see anything dramatic.
But in the end, it'll be...
Yeah. The early and the latter rain. Yeah. And so, kind of interesting to kind of see that that's probably intentional. That I think in the way that the Lord tells the stories, focus on the beginning and on the end, is probably an embedded feature that he put in there, because that's, when you look at history, the early church was dramatic, powerful, the mighty move of God to set the stage. And then you see the transition, because a lot of times this is the transition into the next season. So at these transition points, we tend to see the Lord moving mightily in those times. So it's kind of interesting. That he's the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. You know, that he's and you look at all of creation. God was here in person in the garden at the beginning. He has stepped away. So this is not just the individual stories are fixed this way. I think the whole story, the whole 7,000 years, I think, is fixed this way, that God shows up in the garden in person. God steps away for a season, even though he's still overseeing everything, and then at the end, the Lord returns with his people again. You know, and so you see the active hand of God at the beginning and at the end, and he's there all the way through, but there is something unique about the end points. Yeah. So, all right. Let's go ahead and pray.